This evening, we've invited Bishop Janice Huie, who is the first woman to serve as a United Methodist bishop in the Arkansas area, to be with us tonight for our teaching session. Born in Beeville, Texas, all the way to the University of Texas, cum laude, to Perkins School of Theology, to Emory University and Candler School of Theology with a Doctor of Ministry. She already has fans that are here. She was elected to the episcopacy in 1996. Her husband, Bob, is also a United Methodist minister and has served as a pastoral counselor as well as a pastor in the Southwest jurisdiction. Janice was the first woman appointed to the Arkansas Conference, and she actually participated in merging the Little Rock Conference and the North Arkansas Annual Conference into one single church-wide body. But her passion has always been connecting ministry and the ministry of Christ with the laity. In addition to her focus on her annual conference, the one thing that Janice is really known for is her love and her passion for younger clergy. During the time that she was the bishop of the Arkansas area, and then following that when she served 12 years as the bishop of the Texas Conference, Houston-based Texas Conference, she tripled the number of clergy under 35 years of age and raised $5 million for the development of young clergy for the next generation. You can read her biographical information, and it's impressive. She has served as the president of the Council of Bishops. She has served as the president of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. She served on the board of directors of UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, and she has served as the president of the South Central Jurisdiction College of Bishops. But here are the things that I want to point to related to Janice Huie. She has a keen ability to identify leadership. She's a strategic thinker, and she connects faith and leadership at many, many levels. Her article on missional appointment making drives our attention to focusing on the fact that the local church is the mission of the church, the primary mission of the church. Not the care of clergy, not the development of leadership, that's important, but the mission of the church is our first priority, and when we make appointments, we should be making appointments around the missional needs of the church. Janice is probably one of the most influential bishops in the Council of Bishops. Even though she's officially retired from the Council of Bishops from her active area of service where she's been, she now serves on the faculty and as the staff member of the Texas Methodist Foundation, the largest foundation in the denomination. She's the most admired among the bishops of the Council of Bishops. She's been a mentor, a counselor, and a coach to just about every one of us that have come into the Council of Bishops since 1996. But I want you to hear Janice's words, Bishop Huie's words, when asked about her focus on mission and finding young clergy. She said, "Well, I don't really know what bishops do. I just know that I'm always looking for our most creative folks, what they're doing, what they're proposing, who they're connecting with, and how do we reach the new population in our area. So I try to stay connected to those creative, most entrepreneurial, deeply spiritual, wanting to reach the community people." Janice Huie is one of those rare individuals who has genuine humility and professional capability, and I'm delighted to have her come and provide teaching for us in a time of great change. Bishop Huie, welcome to the Western North Carolina Conference.
Well, friends, I hardly know what to say after an introduction like that, except more than generous, and thank you. And to all of you, friends, it's an honor to be here this evening. It really is. And certainly it's an honor to speak here, especially on a night you're voting, because I know you're going to stay at least through the half. I have had the privilege of being out and visiting in a number of annual conferences over the last 20 years. And I've been to, as you know, or many of you do, to Western North Carolina before. And I would want you to know that in my opinion, Western North Carolina Annual Conference is one of a small number of what I would call bellwether annual conferences for the United Methodist Church in the United States. And here's why I think of you as a bellwether conference. You've called and nurtured and then sent forth some of the strongest leaders that we have in the denomination. One of them is president of the Council of Bishops right now, Bishop Carter. You are always experimenting with new forms of ministry. I looked at your book of stories. I mean, what a wonderful set of stories, and I'm sure those are always just the top edge of the numbers out there. You're investing in the future with a focus on next generation pastors. You probably know that you have 55 pastors under the age of 35. That puts you in raw numbers as the second largest group of under 35 pastors in the United States. And you're doing all of this while you're experimenting, you're talking to one another, and you're maintaining and growing the everyday and important backbone ministries of the church. So it really is an honor for me to be with you and be here and learn from you in this time together. And I am grateful that you're helping to lead the rest of us in the United States. So thank you, thank you. Bishop Leland asked me if I would speak about leadership. And I said that I would, and in part because this is not an easy time to be a leader in the United Methodist Church. The world has changed dramatically in the last few years. There may be some of you out here who are feeling like it wasn't just dramatic turning, it was just totally upside down turning. But for those of us, and I would put myself in this category, I've long assumed that the established institutional church would just keep on thriving generation after generation with good leaders, with good minds, good hearts, good hands set about to do the work. In other words, continuity was what I thought was the world we lived in. And it was for a while. It was for a while. But it is fair to say that the rules have changed, and they've changed dramatically. And so what I want to argue tonight, or at least make the case for, is that's what's called forth from you as leaders. And every single one of you are a leader, you wouldn't be here. That's the role that you play. So I want to make the case that a new and different kind of leadership is being called for. It's not about leading change, which is what we might have thought 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's about leading in the midst of change. So let me say that just a little bit differently. I believe that God has called the people called Methodist right here in this time, this place, Western North Carolina. You've been called. Why has God called you? What is the difference that God is calling you to make in your time, in your place? Another way to ask that same question is, what is God's purpose for you today and tomorrow in the immediate future? What unique gifts do you bring? I listed some, but in your local churches, think about the unique gifts that your particular church brings. Then what role are we being called to play in working with God to bring about the world that God imagines? And see, that's in my language, God's reign on earth as it is in heaven. How do we do that? In a world that has changed, is changing, and for the foreseeable future, the pace of change will accelerate even more rapidly. My friend Gil Rendell, he's my colleague at Texas Methodist Foundation. He reminds all of us on a pretty regular basis that the more complex society becomes, the more sophisticated the leadership must become. So here's what I hope before you all leave here tonight. I hope that when you leave tonight, you will leave with more questions than answers. I hope that you will have some little insight that brings a tiny bit more clarity to your purpose as a Christian leader in this present moment, in this context. I hope that you will find some little insight that will help you increase your own capacity for courage, because courage is called for as we move forward in this new time. And then finally, by the grace of God, I hope that again you'll discover some strength within yourself to be a little bit more resilient in times such as these. So if you're ready, let's see what we can do. So let's start out here and have a little bit of fun. Take a look at this photo. All right, see if you can figure out what that is, if you can guess it. The date on it is a hint. Anybody? So I'll give you a clue. Pope Benedict has just been elected. That's 2005. And this is a photo of St. Peter's Square on the evening that his election was announced. Take a good look. And he came out to give his blessing. When you look at the crowd, what do you see? See all those lights up in the front? That's the news broadcast, ABC, NBC, CBS, the Italian radio and television stations, you know, who are there to report the news that's coming about, give information. You can see reporters back there. The Vatican, you can assume, was in a back room trying to get its authorized version together so that in a day or two or three, they could put out an authorized version of what was going on there. And people are they're standing there waiting. Okay, so now let's fast forward 8 years. You remember Pope Benedict resigned, Pope Francis was elected, new Pope. Look at, same picture, same camera angle. 8 years later, what's different? It was a huge shift. Everybody's got a smartphone. Everyone is taking photos. So who are the reporters here? Everybody. Who are the photographers here? Everybody. And they are also using a huge variety of new social media apps that weren't available when just 8 years earlier. I mean, they've got Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and a bunch of platforms that I have no idea how to name. Here they are, the reporters, and every reporter, meaning everyone with a smartphone, is reporting to their individual constituency. You see, so it's going out on a very individualized basis. Yes, the big ones are still there. It's kind of a top-down, but look what's happened coming from the bottom up. And frankly, unless the Vatican press gets its word out fairly quickly, it just kind of gets lost in the noise. Are you with me? The world has changed. The world has changed. One of the ways we could talk about that is the first one I showed you. I'll come back to this in a minute and say more. That's a picture of a convergent world where there's a lot of sameness in it, and authority comes from the top down. What you see here is a divergent picture where it's individualized and authority comes from the bottom up. So let me do one more change here. So just look at those two side by side. That's the old iPhone, 2007. That's actually what I still have. I'm just telling you the truth here. But the new one is this year's iPhone Max. So with that smartphone, and maybe you can on yours, individuals are now capable of high quality audio and video, and we know from what we know that around the world those phones can report out everything from an incident involving the police to what is happening with migrants on the border of Texas, to a hospital being bombed in Idlib, Iraq, to the most recent mass shooting in Virginia Beach. And the social media apps on those smartphones right there have increasingly the capacity to interfere with elections all around the globe. And finally, those same smartphones with Amazon can deliver just about anything you want to your front door. The world has changed. The world has changed. Last year, a quick story here, during Hurricane Harvey, people in Houston, the waters were rising, you all saw those pictures on television just a few weeks before yours, the floods here. And so what would happen in Houston, people would call, they would get trapped in their houses, they'd call 911, which is what you're supposed to do, and then they would call friends because they couldn't get out of their houses, and so volunteers came with jet skis and canoes and boats and about anything else that would float to join with the emergency personnel in moving around in these neighborhoods and helping to evacuate these homes. One of the big challenges they ran into was that sometimes, as people called in, as many as 5 or 6 rescuers would arrive at a home only to find that it was empty because someone else had already rescued the occupants. And conversely, down the street, somebody would have been waiting and waiting and waiting with no one to get there. So a guy from Chapelwood United Methodist Church, who's a software engineer, said, we need to fix this. So the guy stayed up all night making an app, creating an app that would allow the rescuers and the rescued to communicate with each other so that by the next morning it was could be distributed to everyone, the public personnel, where you think of as top down, the police, the fire, the ambulance, and also all these folks with an iPhone and their canoes. In 24 hours, they did that in water rescue. It's a new way of leading. You hear that? This is a bottom-up way of approaching a problem rather than a top-down. That's what we would call divergent problem solving. We'll say more about that in a minute. Well, the changes that are happening around us are not the only changes, but all these technological changes, they're part of what is accelerating the change all around us. Change that can be positive, it can be negative, or in between there. And thoughtful leaders from a variety of places are trying to describe reality today, trying to help us understand what is it that we see. So, I want to take a few minutes. This is some of Gil Rendell's work, and talk about the movement from a convergent time, which is where we came from and where the culture came from, to a divergent time. A convergent time is a time when we love to be together as a group, as people. It was really a 20th century way. So convergent problems, for example, have only one answer. A convergent problem would be a question like this: how far is it from Stewart Auditorium to downtown Asheville? That's a problem that has a clear answer. We could all agree on that answer. But divergent questions or divergent problems have answers that depend on the circumstance or the context. Here would be a divergent question. Why do you want to go to Asheville? There could be 800 responses to that, and they'd all be right, because it would be your individual response. Where do you want to go in Asheville? It could be 800 responses to that. Divergent answers aren't right or wrong. They just depend on the context or the circumstances. Most of our leaders in church today, like those of us sitting in this room and me, we grew up in a convergent world. And a convergent world, Gill says, is a time when the questions and the answers are the same for everyone. In a divergent culture, the person who is different just kind of conforms or goes along or doesn't put up a fuss. It's the immigrant moving in who tries to be the same as everybody. So without embarrassing anybody, here's sort of the breakout piece for the generational difference between convergent and divergent. How many of you in this room were born before 1965? Raise your hand. That's me too. Look around at yourself. Okay, put your hands down. How many of you in this room were born after 1965? Do you see the difference in the size here? It's probably 3 to 1. So most of our church leaders, me included, I am much more comfortable in a convergent world where things are the same. See, I'm a baby boomer. I was born as part of that. So I like everybody to get along. I like people to come together. It's a good time. And part of the challenge, though, that we're in today is that the culture, though, has moved into a much more divergent stage. Convergence has a certainty about it. Divergence takes certainty away because it's individualized. And divergence makes us discover that there's more than one answer in a situation. In a divergent cultures, both the questions, like the ones I posed a while ago, and the answers can be multiple, and people tend to lead with their differences. So the 20th century was defined by convergence, consensus, agreement, and if you think about what happened, many of you could tell the story because of the number of us, including me, that raised our hands. I mean, there was the Great Depression. I mean, I was born after that. But then there was World War II. This was a time when people came together. We needed each other. And people felt we are all in this together. Certainly that was the understanding that my father and mother had, and that's what they raised me. The focus was on the group. The focus was on the community. I heard my dad, I grew up on a farm out in the country, but my dad would say, and I heard him say it a number of times, what is good for the community is good for me. And he believed that. At that time, there was a very large middle class, and the trust that we had as a nation and as a people, trust in our institutions was high. And so this was a great time for mainline Protestantism, especially the United Methodist Church. We flourished in that season. And when you think about when did we come together to form this new church, the United, not just the Methodist Church, but we merged to form the United Methodist Church, it was right in the heart of that convergent time when we all came together. What we said when we did evangelism or we reached out into the community, we did that by saying, come and join us. Come be a part of our family. We talk about that now as an attractional model of ministry. And it was wonderful and it was effective and it worked well. And that's what our leaders, including me, that's what we learned to do. And that's who we were in that era. The challenge for us now is that in the culture around us, we've moved substantially, the culture has, in a divergent time. By the way, what would be one of the examples of convergent that you're in right now? It would be this auditorium on a Friday night in the mountains here, and look at you. You're sitting in an auditorium in the United Methodist Church having a church meeting. Now that's a convergent decision that you're making. It's a great. Let me say what the good side of convergence is before I move on to divergent. This brings many gifts, and I could wax long about those. I'll just mention a couple, but you might want to think about some more. Mutual support goes with convergence, sharing of resources, institutional strength, the strong and the weak work together, people teach each other, and connection, which is who we are. Those are all qualities of divergence. And when we talk about the change that we need to make, we also have to ask ourselves, what is it that is so important to us as United Methodists or Methodists that we want to carry along? Remember when the Israelites left Egypt, they asked themselves and they were going out to the promised land, didn't know what they were getting into. It was a very challenging time. They asked themselves, what was it critical for them to bring along? And you remember what they brought? They carried Joseph's bones. They carry that along. We've got to ask ourselves, what is it that is convergent, that is critical to our identity as United Methodists, who we are, that we want to bring along in this new time, and what is it that we could just let go by the way as we move into this new world? So the movement toward divergence began shifting really, people would say, in the last 25 years or so of the 20th century. That's about the time that people were starting to stand up and say, I'm different and I'm good. So you think about the Black Power movement, the women's movement, gay pride movement, anti-war movement, and all those things started happening at the end of the last century. And then in the 21st century, these differences have been given new energy and strengths, again, by the kind of fast changing of technology. So think about Black Lives Matter, think about Me Too, think about Occupy Wall Street. I mean, all of those are sort of fueled by the changes in technology. That's the culture in which you and I are doing ministry. And it represents a significant change for us. This new generation, that born after 1965, and particularly Generation Z and the millennials even more so. I mean, they're far more comfortable, for example, with social media and technology. They don't respond very well to an attractional model of ministry. So rather than us saying only come, we've also got to be able to go. And it's ascending as much as anything. And to connect with that generation out there, which most of our congregations, not all, but most of our congregations are struggling to connect with those that were, are what we would call a Gen Z, or that's the youngest, or a millennial generation. It's people like me, it's hard for us to imagine that, and it's important that we think about that. And you all are doing some of that already. I mean, there's fresh expressions, new places for new people. The church is making an effort here. We just have to continue to lean in of it. There's dinner church in the conference I came from. Dinner church, none of that's held on church property. Project Curate, none of that's held on church property. FAM apartment ministries, these for us were some new models of evangelism that were once were traditional and now are part of a divergent culture. Let me just talk about a couple of other challenges that are related to this convergent and divergent way of thinking. Another one of the challenges that we face is, I believe, it's the erosion of the middle class and the widening wealth disparity in our culture. And I say that because the United Methodist Church historically, as I said earlier, we were the middle class church. We were mainline Protestantism. We were also, in addition to being faithful to Jesus, we were part of the social glue that helped the culture be together. But as the middle class has shrunk, we have too. And our congregations tend to have become more and more dependent on a handful of larger givers because there simply aren't the other folks there. We don't yet have an evangelism model to reach poor people, immigrant populations, and others, that models of evangelism that are self-sustaining. It's one of the places that's our growing edge as we move into this new world. And a final challenge is that part of the convergent time meant that we trusted our institutions. Institutional trust was very high. Unfortunately, in that divergent time that we're in now, we ask a lot more questions. We are not so sure we trust our leaders, and where once we might give them the benefit of the doubt, now in a divergent time, it's easy for us to say, well, I know more about that than somebody else does. I mean, we've seen that happen in our other denominations, and where trust once gets broken, it is really, really difficult to rebuild. And to support one another and we need to support resilience. So let's take a minute here, and let's move this, and let me just, okay, we're doing good here on time. I want you to, in pairs or threes, whatever's convenient, in these chairs that you're sitting in, I want you to turn to one another and take at least the first question. I'm going to give you probably about 6 or 7 minutes. How has your congregation experienced some aspect of this shift? Where have you seen this in the world that you're living in here? And if you have time, you can go on to what difference has this shift made. And I'm talking to here the shift from convergence to divergence, from communal, we're all in this together, to everybody's doing their individual thing and pulling out their iPhone. How have you shifted that? So you understand what to talk about? How has your congregation experienced this? Okay? Turn to one another, 2s, 3s, 4s, ready, set, go. Okay, everybody. Okay, I hope that, you might have even had an opportunity to play with this a little bit. One of the spiritual leaders for me that has really helped me think about what this time is like spiritually and what it means to be called into a time of transformation is Richard Rohr. Many of you will know him. Father Richard Rohr lives out in New Mexico. One of the things that he writes is transformation more often happens not when something new begins, but when something old falls apart. And I have to say that after General Conference, when everybody's mad at everybody, I came back and said to myself, reading a little Richard Rohr and reminding myself that scripturally too, that transformation most often begins not when something new happens, but when something old falls apart and God does a new thing in the midst of that. So we're going to try to turn now to sort of how might we move into this new season. So I want to talk about for a minute, just maybe introduce another word into here. It's a fair amount of new vocabulary, but this one is kind of a fun word, I think. It comes from Dr. Susan Beaumont, and I'll put the references on a slide near the end. She was formerly an Alban Institute consultant, and she's now independently consultant. She gives us this, what I think is a beautiful image of this shift from convergence to a divergent season, and she refers to it in her work as a liminal season. And the way she defines liminal, she says, and it's up there on the slide, a quality of ambiguity and disorientation that occurs in a transitory situation in space when a person or group of people is betwixt and between something that has ended and a new situation that has not yet begun. I mean, at least from my perspective, that very much describes where we are right now in the United Methodist Church. Something new, something old has ended, but something new has not yet begun. We're betwixt and between. She calls that liminal space because liminal comes from the Latin word liman, which means threshold, like the threshold of a door. And in a threshold or on a threshold, you're not where you used to be, but you're not yet where you're going to be. And I picked out this little slide here because that person, whoever it is, jumping off that thing with energy and enthusiasm and adventure and excitement and surely some apprehension and uncertainty, that's what it means to be in a liminal space. You might think about it as if you learned whenever was the first time you got on a bike. There's the excitement and the possibility that goes with, I'm going to learn how to ride a bike. And you younger ones, y'all have to do one of those scooter things that goes around, in the cities now. But old people like me, we can talk about riding a bike. But it's also the uncertainty, the kind of apprehension that comes with risk, that we might not know what's going to happen, that we might fail. And it takes courage, it takes resilience to head out there and jump off into a place that you don't really know how it will end. It's a liminal season, a threshold time. It's a time of risk-taking. It's a time, I think, where we are in the United Methodist Church. We are not where we came from, especially if you think back even 20 years, which is not a very long period of time in the church, but we're not yet where we're going to be if we think about 20 years from now. And for most of us in leadership roles in particular, where we are is characterized both by apprehension and uncertainty by all the things that are changing and we don't have control over it, and led by the excitement and the possibility of what God is doing and how we might be a part of that. So I want to remind us, though, that being in a threshold time or a liminal season, this is not entirely new to the people called Methodists. We really have been here before, just not in our lifetimes. During the 18th century, England underwent this huge societal transition when it shifted from an agrarian-based culture to an industrial-based culture. That happened in the United States during the 19th century, and during both those centuries, in those two different contexts, United Methodists on both continents provided major leadership in the church and in the culture. That was, as it turned out, a very fruitful time for the people called Methodists. We started schools, colleges, and universities so that every child could be educated and have the prospect of a better future. We built hospitals to care for the sick and retirement homes to care for the old. We started community centers for immigrants and the poor so they could learn skills to create better lives for themselves and their children. Methodists spoke out against injustice wherever we found it, slavery, Jim Crow, child labor, and more. Methodists advocated for the right of women to vote and to preach, and over again, Methodists invested in the larger community and in a better future for all God's children. This is in our genes, friend. This is in yours, mine, whatever your age, it's part of our DNA. So what might we learn from our historic Wesleyan strengths to connect us again with the yearnings, the hopes, the hurts of people today, so that we can provide the same kind of leadership that our ancestors provided, which was to lead God's people into this future that God imagines. A reign of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. What might we learn from our Wesleyan DNA that amid all this chaos and noise around us, and there's plenty of it, how do we stay focused on what is God's purpose for us in our context, in our time? What gives us the capacity to lead toward a realistic future in the middle of all these changes going on? What from our past helps us to step back from fear, which is around us, and step forward into hope? Okay, so let's talk a little bit with each other, just a few moments here, about what kind of opportunities do you see in this in-between time. We won't deal with threats. You can do threats another time. So we don't have a long time here for conversation. If we had a long time, we'd work through these. But let's just take that first question. Don't be scared off by the threats. So I'd rather you work the opportunities. So turn to one another like you just did, and we're going to take about 5 minutes here. Think about where you are, your context, whatever your context is, your role, whatever it is. What are the opportunities that God is opening up for you in this liminal threshold season? Ready, set, go.
All right, we're going to take a break from the teaching session. And I'm going to read the results of the clergy ballot for the alternates to the jurisdictional conference. Our rules state that the three clergy receiving the most votes will be the three alternates to jurisdictional conference. And the results of the alternate results are John Boggs, 173 votes. Linda Ferguson, 158 votes. Benjamin Carson, 136 votes. And this completes the clergy balloting. Do we have the laity? Right, are you ready to hear the results of the laity? Yes. All right. You needed to elect three people to the General Conference with 630 votes, required for election 316. There is an election. Helen Ride with 342 votes. The number is 5052. There is another election. Lynette Whitaker, 5063, with 328 votes. You'll need to prepare for ballot number 6 to elect one person. And here are the remainder of the votes on ballot number 5. Linda Linfors, 5036, 296 votes. Tim Kincaid, 5029, 214 votes. Coley Hooker, 5024 with 170 votes. Wade Lofton, 5039 with 142 votes. Angie Wright, 5067 with 61 votes. Harry Underwood, 5060 with 53 votes. Tanya Lanier, 5030 with 38 votes. Hank Dozier, 5012 with 30 votes. That completes the balloting. You'll need to prepare for ballot number 6 and select only one person. All right, look over your selections and select your first person, the only person you'll vote for on this ballot. All right, let's wait just a moment. We need the screen. This screen is working on this side, but this screen isn't on the other side. How do we correct that? All right, there you go. Please look at your selections. You may vote now. right, that concludes the ballot. I now consider the ballot to be closed, and we'll report the results later.
Okay. Well, thank you all. So let's see, we'll get this back up on the screen. So we're over here now, kind of going back to where we were, trying to think about what might we learn from our past that helps us step forward into this new day. So let's go to this slide. We're going to talk about, again, how are we going to do this? And I want to talk, well, before I do that, let me say a little bit about purpose. I want to just read, this is a paraphrase from Mr. Wesley, because beginning with the end in mind, talking about our purpose, this is the way John Wesley framed it. And I hope you'll listen for convergent themes, and this is just one sentence, convergent and divergent both together. Okay? This is the way Wesley framed purpose. I continue to dream and pray about a revival of holiness in our day that moves forth in mission and creates authentic community in which each person can be unleashed through the empowerment of the Spirit to fulfill God's intention. Can you hear the themes that are combining both convergent, authentic community? That's a convergent reality. And the focus on moving forth, our day, and most importantly, each person. That's a divergent reality. Wesley, even in his day, knows how to hold those together. What he did in stating that is to begin with the end in mind. Again, God's reign on earth as it is in heaven. Or we say it in our mission statement, to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And so these early Methodists stressed the importance of unlearning sin and brokenness and learning holiness of heart and life. They stressed forgiveness and friendship as key signs of God's reign. They stressed that hate, violence, injustice, cruelty, brokenness belong to the old order that we were leaving behind, and that love, kindness, justice, mercy, that those qualities turn the old world upside down and are crucial to faithful Christian life and imagination. So when we talk about focusing on purpose, and I'm going to say a little bit more about this in just a minute, what that means is that we begin with God, not with us. It's not like, what do I want? This is what is God desiring? Where is God already at work in the world? So this is beginning with God's purpose invites us to imagine God's purposes for the world, not our purposes for God's world. And so here in Western North Carolina, then, to ask yourselves, what is the future that God imagines for you in this time, in this place? And as importantly, where do you already see God at work? God isn't like waiting on us. God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, is out there at work in the world. So we need eyes to see God's reign and how we might align our mission and ministry with those purposes. So in this kind of liminal space, threshold space, it's really critical to focus on God's purpose, not ours, in the work that we do. You and I are working in a very long established institution. The Methodist Church in the U.S., almost 250 years old. So let's talk about, when we get into this purpose, how things can begin to shift. So I want to talk a minute here about public mission and private mission. So stay with me, and I'll try to help us maybe get a glimpse into at least what I think is part of the challenge we're facing as we want to do what God is asking of us, but how it is that sin, maybe, or maybe just ourselves, pulls us aside. So let's try this again. Now, my slide went away, and there it came. Thank you, whoever's doing that. I want to use a different metaphor, a different image than the church, because sometimes it's easier to see the speck in your neighbor's eye rather than the log in your own. So this little picture is a public schools picture. So let's try to do that. Let's talk about schools. The public mission of schools is what? To educate children, right? Everybody agrees. It's to educate children. But how is it that somehow in life that isn't always the way it comes out? So you know that every organization, like schools, has its own networks and groups that include people with differences and needs and interest in relation to the school. And they all, for example, they all share a concern for educating children, but they might not all have that as just the first thing at the top of their list. I mean, you think about the school board. Well, now it's responsible to the electorate. And so it's responding. The people are concerned about having their taxes raised. So that's one of the interests that gets in there. What about the teachers? That's another group. Parents, that's another group. Administrators, they're trying to get the tests. So when we say the public mission is to educate children, it's very easy in our schools for the private mission to be caught in the cross current of all those other interests. You understand what you kind of get the picture here? That becomes the private mission. And the private mission sometimes trumps the public mission. Just talking about schools here, you get it? Now let's talk about the church. Okay, so you ask, what is the public mission of your congregation? Are you following me? What is the public mission? But then now also, let's think about all the private constituent groups within even the smallest congregation. So we might think about who the largest givers are and what their interests are. We might think about what's a key Sunday school class. We might think about how important it is to keep a certain group happy. And so what we discover over time, whoops, I went the wrong way there, sorry. So that the private mission of those interests can trump the public mission, which is, in general, to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I'll give you an example here about how I learned that the hard way when I was pastor in a church. So our church was doing very well. It was growing some. We had a wonderful older adult Sunday school class that had been meeting for a long time, but its attendance had gotten down to about, not any more on an average than like 5 people. Saints they were. Some of our largest givers they were, only I wasn't smart enough to figure that out at the time. And they met in the most beautiful Sunday school space that we had in that church. Well, we were also working really hard. This was a neighborhood that had a lot of young families moving in. There were starter homes that were being built in the area. And we were just, I mean, God was good to us. We were getting overrun with all these young families and their children, and our Sunday school was overflowing. And we had this young adult class, and every Sunday it got bigger than it had been the Sunday before, and they were well over 25. They were meeting in a room that wasn't much bigger than a broom closet, and they needed room to grow. So I said, the senior pastor, of course, I say to the education director one day, look, you need to go tell the older Sunday school class, it had a name, that they need to swap out. And she said to me, smarter than I was, there's no way I'm walking in that room. And I said, well, okay, I'll do it. So let me say I only lasted about 6-7 minutes in that room. And guess what? They stayed, and and I found another space for the young adult class to have a little more room to thrive. Now, I will say there was something of a happy ending here. I did scare them, I think, and so they got busy and recruited some more people to their Sunday school class. So in the end, but it was a great learning lesson for me. See, because I was all into the public mission, and I didn't really understand and appreciate as much as I needed to the role of the private mission with those. Doesn't that happen in some way or other in almost every church? So you get out and you want to be making disciples connect, especially with new generations. And it's the generational piece is such a challenge for us. And so we were trying to make a connect with new generations, and yet at the same time, you know, we've got a private mission that from time to time will trump the public mission. So as we move along here, we're not going to talk about this to have time in this setting, but I'll just say some questions that I had thought about, and I might leave them with you for conversation back in your own congregation. What's the public mission of your congregation? Almost everybody has one. Almost every congregation has some public mission. And to what extent is it guided by the private mission of your strongest constituents? That can happen in a couple of ways, by the way. It can be resources that they provide or someone else does, but it can also simply be attention. And I'll tell you a story about that later on, but it's where does the leadership put its attention? So let me go on here. So thinking about, these are little takeaways. I hope they're kind of just something for you to mull over as you go home to your congregation. It is critical, I know I've said this multiple times, but to clarify what is the difference you are trying to make. That's the question we at TMF have found is the most helpful to congregations, rather than saying you need a purpose, or even than saying what is God's purposes for you. We try to engage them in a conversation that says, around the question, what is the difference that you are trying to make in this time, in this place? And then we try to frame that along with the question, now, in this time, in this place, not yesterday or tomorrow, how will you be with God, and how will you be with one another? Who is your neighbor now? That's one of the biggest challenges, again, that we face with this generational difference we have in the church today, is thinking about who is our neighbor now. Frequently, we really don't know who our neighbors are. We might think we know, but we don't know them as well as we might. Another question we like to ask at TMF when we work with congregations is, what story in Scripture most describes your congregation today? You know, that's about an hour's, easy hour's conversation with a leadership group in a local church. What story in Scripture most describes where your congregation sees itself today? And you might then pair with that, where is God calling you? What's the story toward which God is calling you? So clarifying purpose and stability. These are uncomfortable questions, by the way, and I know they are, but they're challenging questions, but they're also questions that help move us deeper into where God is calling us. Related to this is the second takeaway here, is to move beyond problem solving. Okay? When we get uncomfortable with these hard questions like where is God calling us? What difference are we called to make? What Scripture story? Who is our neighbor? What happens is we frequently turn to solving problems because we know how to do that. And so since we know how to do it, we go do it again. In Heifetz's language, that's a technical fix, but we're asking an adaptive question. I mean, we know how to fix things. If the air conditioner doesn't work, you call the repair company. So if the children's Sunday school is getting smaller and smaller, we come up with maybe it needs new curriculum. Maybe they need to be in a new class. Maybe we need a different teacher. Maybe that's problem solving. In a changing world, problem solving won't help us. It really just delays the struggling with more challenging and uncomfortable questions about purpose. So if you find yourself just solving problems, try to try to say, could we set that aside for a moment and go back to, it's a hard question, what is the difference that God is calling us to make? Because that's the question that invites us to listen to God and to listen to our neighbors and maybe to take a risk into trying something new. Number 3, be steady in purpose but flexible in strategy. Okay, this is a divergent way of doing things. So in stepping out into liminal space, you got to be clear about your purpose. But look, there's more than one way to get most anywhere, right? So if you're clear about that, then invite people to bring differences. Invite divergent thinking. If you're still living in a convergent world, people will always, let's everybody do it together. That's great, but that's not the new thinking. So think about, especially from your next generation folks, what are some other ways to do this? How can you be flexible in your strategy while and give permission for people to have differences? And verbally give people permission to be different. And even if it doesn't all seem to fit the first time, maybe sit with it a while and then give it another chance. I've said this in some other ways, but as we think about going forward, it's about both improving what we already have. That's really important. There's lots of material out there on how we might improve what we do in our attractional church ministries. That's probably what we do at TMF. We would say about ourselves, we probably spend 75% of our time and resources working to help congregations improve what they already do. But friends, our future lies over here in creation. And so we're trying to lean into that and spend more of our time, more of our resources creating. This is a both and world. I just can't say that strongly enough. John Wesley taught his followers to hold together things that other people thought were oppositional. But we hold them together. Even though it's a tension, we hold them together. Justification and sanctification, evangelism and social action, the sacraments and small groups, knowledge and vital piety. It's a both and approach that invites Methodists to reach beyond what we are currently doing and connect with new people in new places, especially those that live much more comfortably in divergent spaces. Okay? So here's our challenge. I'll say this, is that we as United Methodists, and again, I do this all the time and I try to catch myself, we live in a yes, but world. And we've adopted a lot of that yes, but language. Do you want to cross the Jordan and get into the promised land? Yes, but there are giants out there. Do you want to follow Jesus? Yes, but I would have to change. Do you want your church to make a difference in your community? Yes, but you don't want to leave the building. You see? Not yes, but. It's both and. We're trying to live in the tension of both and, to be patient with one another, to get ourselves out of the way of either or thinking, and to give us the patience and the resilience and the courage and perseverance to keep stepping forward. Okay? Here's another both and. Both attractional and missional. So quickly here, in a convergent culture, as I said earlier, it made a lot of sense that the way we increased fruitfulness was based on an attractional model of ministry. And so we assumed that in that model, we needed all of us to improve our welcoming skills, enhance our worship services, strengthen our small group ministries, so that people would be attracted to come to us and join us and be members, hear that language, members of our congregation. there are many people out there for whom that is still the right things. But when we think about a divergent culture, these are faith communities that now must develop ministries that come from go or send. And they're activities that primarily benefit people who are not members of our church and frankly may not ever become members of our church. And they require a very different posture toward our neighborhood and a more deliberate outward focus and willingness to carry Christ's love to where people already live, work, and play, rather than just keep hoping that they're going to come to us. About 18 months ago, my colleague Lisa Greenwood and I had the privilege of visiting in one day a number of Fresh Expressions in the Florida Annual Conference. And I know you're doing Fresh Expressions here, but in one day, this was a rural area of Florida. In one day, we visited a yoga class, a Mexican food restaurant, a dog park, a low-income mobile home park, and a tattoo parlor, for which my husband told me, don't even think it. Now, the church, the primary church, to which the pastor was appointed, I told you it was in a rural area. The church, the attractional church, has maybe on a good Sunday 45. So the pastor continues to serve them, but along with a few courageous laypersons, he's out there helping the courageous laypersons and himself discover their neighbors and start ministries that they had no idea about until they got there. And these ministries don't all succeed. Some of his, they failed along the way, but they just keep learning. They just keep learning from what fails and keep on going. That's what I mean by attractional and missional. And last here, to encourage you to innovate, experiment, and keep on learning. Dr. Greg Jones at Duke calls this understanding of innovation at the same time staying connected to the wisdom of the past, traditioned innovation. I'm sure you've heard that term before, traditioned innovation. It means imagining God's future, taking risks, experimenting, failing, learning from our failures, and doing it all over again. In the context of that, it means studying Scripture, praying, meeting our neighbors, discerning, and then gathering all the courage we can muster and stepping out into God's future, because that is also, it's God's future and it is our future as United Methodists. So along the way, we'll have to unlearn some things, but we'll also keep on learning here. Gil Rendell likes to say, if it's about learning something new, at the same time, it's also about unlearning some old things. So I want to close here, let me give you these are just a couple of slides I put in for us to think about, who is your neighbor here. That's from a Houston-based ministry. This is from that same one. I've talked about resilience tonight. That's another just kind of a fun one. This is Gil Rendell's language, quiet courage. This was something that Texas Methodist Foundation sponsored on innovation. That's a good question, and that's what I wanted to get to, are some of the resources that are available that you could use. So let me close with a quick story here, and we'll call it an evening. The Reverend Clint Rabb was one of Bob's and my closest friends in ministry. And if that name sounds vaguely familiar for some of you, it's because he was one of the staff members at UMCOR who was killed in the Haiti earthquake. His stepson, Andrew Payne, was a young pastor, and he was appointed where I was the bishop in the Texas Annual Conference. Not long after Andrew was appointed in the Texas Conference, another pastor, Andrew was pretty young, this was an older pastor, took Andrew out to lunch and told him that there was no future for the United Methodist Church and that there was no future for him in the Texas Annual Conference, and that he should be looking for some other place and some other line of work. I can't believe somebody did that, but they did. And so Andrew, young guy, he called his stepfather, Clint, for counsel. This was just a few months before Clint was killed. And he said to his stepfather, what should I do? And Clint talked to him and he said, Andrew, it might be a bad time for a few pastors, but it won't be a bad time for others. And for some pastors, it will be the best time of all. Because, son, more is possible now than ever was possible before. Andrew, he said, I believe in the future of the church. And friends, I want to say to you, it's a liminal time. It's a time of apprehension. It's a time of change. But I'm so excited and filled with joy and wonder, thanksgiving for all of you, because I believe that God has a strong and good and hopeful future for the people called Methodist. I believe it's true for the people in Western North Carolina, and I believe it's true in thousands of other places around the world. And that, as our Father Wesley said, God is with us, and we are not alone. Thanks be to God. Thank you all, and good evening.
Thank you, Janice. Oh, so good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Boy, looking forward to that liminal time. You can understand why Bishop Huie received 2 awards from Perkins School of Theology for being the outstanding preacher. And we have been delighted and blessed by your presence with us tonight, Bishop Huie. Thank you so much for your instruction and for your words of hope. Thank you.